Hello, my name is Michael Bjorn. I work at Ericsson Consumer and Industry Lab. This is me in real life, by the way. This is what I look like outside of VR. And this is what I look today in VR. We are going to have a session here about the dematerialized office. Now, this is the idea that the Internet of Senses, where we can use um, not only sound and vision, but also touch, taste, and smell on the internet in the future, maybe 10 years from now, would also be something that we would be using in the workplace. So we will go through a project that we did about this, and then we'll have a workshop about the findings from this project.
Now, that was a clip from Inside VR from one of the workshops we ran internally about our Dematerialized Office report that was released late last year. Unfortunately, we will not have that workshop here, but I will give you an overview of how we approach this theme, not only with traditional market research, but also by trying to practice what we preached. More specifically, although we first used VR to form focus group sessions with consumers already about 5 years ago, this is the first time we've actually used ourselves as the primary study group for qualitative research. The reason for this is probably obvious to many of you, given that we are now running this conference online and on a computer screen. But it was then, of course, due to the pandemic and the fact that a large part of the world was more or less in lockdown during the period of this study. Now, the idea of an Internet of Senses is that going forward, we will not only be using AR and VR, but we will also be able to extend that experience with touch, taste, and smell to create a more immersive form of the internet as we know it today. Now, we wanted to make an enterprise version of that Internet of Senses report, not the least because we saw how a lot of work activities were moving to the internet, while we felt that the tools available, such as Teams, Zoom, and Skype, etc., left a lot to wish for. We had also started reading about how working from home was affecting people. And then I don't only mean the idea about Zoom fatigue. Indications were that tasks involving reading and writing, as well as having private one-on-one conversations, were actually easier to perform while working from home. But conversely, collaborative meetings, workshops, and ideation sessions were suffering. Anything involving multi-party interaction, in fact, seemed to be less positive in the work from home situation. So we thought that testing the idea of an Internet of Senses at work would be quite appropriate. Imagine that by 2030, your laptop may have been replaced by a digital workstation that allows for full virtual presence anywhere. Not only would your colleagues appear and sound totally real, but you could also use anything in the room and everything would smell and feel real to the touch. Now, talking about this in 2020 makes a lot of sense because we have seen that the pandemic has become what we could call a digital tipping point. Now, if we compare the data that we have collected over these 2 years, so 2019 being the purple bars here and 2020 being the blue bars here, we could see that there's a jump in what respondents think is likely to be available by 2030. Whether that's a wearable that lets you feel oncoming weather, AR glasses that let you see through walls or buildings, a headband that transmits sound directly to your brain, the ability to convey smell and taste to others, or the ability to convey hot or cold sensations to others, or even replying to messages by thinking instead of typing. All of these figures have taken up to 25% leap in believability, so to speak, among respondents, due probably to the situation we are in right now, where we're always working from home. Now, we decided then to try to practice what we preach in order to be able to do some kind of qualitative part of research for this project. Of course, we couldn't explore the Internet of Senses per se, but we could indeed start using at least VR for everyday work. So what we did inside of Ericsson Research then was that we had a 5 weeks trial in a 10-person project team using VR whenever possible for team meetings, team building sessions, project planning meetings, workshops, and presentations. The method that we used was that all participants kept a VR meeting diary where they, after each meeting, would write down their impressions of the meeting. And then we had a final VR workshop where the experiences among the team were discussed. We used mainly a VR platform called Glue for this, but also Rec Room, AltSpace VR, and an Ericsson internal platform. And the main headset that was used by the participant was the Oculus Quest. Now, if we look at some of the results from the diaries, one thing that stood out was a lot of comments about the usefulness of VR. So for example, and here I quote, "The use of spatial audio really helps to allow a discussion where several can talk at the same time, since it's easier to make out the individual voices compared to when using, for example, Teams." Or, "The boardroom, which is one of the rooms that we used for these meetings, gave a sense of concentration, made me more focused on listening to the speaker. The arrangement of chairs in a semicircle also made discussions easier." And a final example, "Great to see people forming natural groups with natural distances and some unsolicited remarks on the spatial effects of audio." So overall, many positive comments about the actual usefulness of VR. When you think about how much this felt as a real meeting then, the immersion effect, here are some quotes from the diaries about that. "Positive, to discuss, be able to illustrate the concept with body language, see the other's reactions." Another quote, "I took my physical chair to the same place as a virtual chair and sat down. It felt more like a usual conference meeting when we're sitting down on a chair around a table. I felt like we were more together when we sat on a cushion on the floor around a chessboard. It probably felt more real as I sat as well on my real floor at home." So many of these things, as you can see, are about mimicking physical and digital space in order to create immersion. The same could also be said about drawing on the whiteboard. So here's the final quote. "The VR drawing tool is very rough, but this really was the key to move on. The alternative would be sharing a PowerPoint or whiteboard, but in VR we could see each other's reactions, make sure everyone understand." So after that period of 5 weeks, we did a final workshop. And here are the results of that workshops as seen from inside VR. So this is the space that we used for our concluding workshop in VR. As you can see, it's a round space. We have posters along the walls there where we then asked a number of different questions, and we had the participants put post-it notes on them in order to share their thoughts and reflections. So let's go down there and look at what this actually gave us. So here we're down at the space, and we can go over here to the beginning where we first had a couple of instruction pictures. So we had questions then that we stated and some comments that people could then share on post-its. And we asked people to walk around in pairs, max 5 minutes per station, and then we will meet up and summarize these things, and there will be a report for us internally as well. And we also asked people to consider how their perception of VR has changed during this trial that we did from starting until where we are now. So let's look at the questions that we had. The first one was, what have you learned during the trial overall? So about meetings, one thing that came up that we hadn't thought so much about was that there wasn't as much crosstalk. So microphones were actually not as annoying to others. So spurious sounds in the microphone was not as annoying to other people as it sometimes is the case. About VR itself, it's also important that you need to get familiar and play around before starting with the actual work meetings. The interaction then, people pointed out that body language can be very important. You can do things with your hands and with your movements.
And speaking of movements, the fact that you can move around in space when talking was also something that stood out for people. So if we move to one of the first specific questions, then what has been surprising during the trial? A few different things here, but I think what stands out here is the idea that it really feels real sometimes. What has been positive? Many positive things, more playful, more immersion, spatial audio is very good, for example. But there were also some negative things. So what has been disappointing and difficult? Well, for example, these devices are front heavy, so you can easily get an ache in your face. But as you see here, the spelling is wrong. It shouldn't be days, it should be face. So typing is, of course, another issue that people had. When did VR not work well? Well, for example, for joint document editing, that's a challenge in VR. What was the most important feature? Again, many features seen as important, but eye contact stood out as an interesting one, because when avatars actually simulate eye contact, we found out that people actually perceive that as real eye contact, interestingly enough. In what type of meetings did VR work best? Well, we only tried interactive meetings here, more or less. We did have a few presentations as well, but what's interesting that stood out here is, of course, then simple things such as when we were gathered around a fire or a chess table. So even for work purposes, these social settings were important. And that is also reflected in the recommendations that people had for using VR for work at Ericsson Research, because casual meetings stand out quite much, practice and playing games, and team building, for example. So those were the findings from this final qualitative interactive workshop that we did with people, where they could go in pairs and discuss these different questions and give feedback on post-it notes.
After we had done both the diaries and the final concluding workshop, we analyzed the results. And a few things actually stood out and surprised us quite much. First of all, the overall importance and power of spatial audio and the elimination of crosstalk, due to the fact that you have probably the microphone closer to your mouth than when you're using a computer. The fact also that avatars are just as good as or better than photorealistic representation was a surprise, as well as the concentration improvement versus using PC for meetings. There were also many comments about the positive effect on health, because you're adding motion and variation to the workday. And of course then, the way that people actually did make their physical and virtual worlds blend, for example, by placing a physical chair in the VR position. So what was gained by using VR then? Well, first of all, we had more attention, better concentration and energy. There was improved communication and indeed a sense of presence. People also said that there were more efficient discussions due to richer communication modes. So the spatial posture and audio, gestures and eye contact, for example. People also found VR supporting team building better than PC. And then, of course, then the better posture by adding natural movement. But there were also some things that we lost. The difficulties in writing and creating text and documents, for example, were obvious. People couldn't eat or drink during the meetings. And if they had pets or kids, it was difficult to keep an eye out for what was happening in real life. There's also space needed to move or stand, because if you're sitting down where everyone else is standing, it creates cognitive dissonance for the other people. And the head-mounted displays of these VR headsets are quite front heavy, so there was also face ache complaints, or as one person said, very hot face and tired from standing after 1 hour. But let's also look at the quantitative results of our Dematerialized Office report and see what that turned up. So first of all, we in this report say that the Dematerialized Office may indeed be a reality by 2030. As an example, close to 6 in 10 want a full sense virtual warehouse, both for buying from suppliers, but a similar warehouse could also be used for selling to customers. And as I already mentioned, the pandemic has indeed become a digital tipping point. Nearly 6 in 10 foresee a permanent increase in online meetings with customers, suppliers, and colleagues. And there is a positive effect on the environment from dematerializing your office environment, as many as 77% indicate that an Internet of Senses for business use would indeed make companies more sustainable. And if you look at where this type of technology will be used, well, surprisingly, maybe marketing and sales was the most probable area, according to the respondents in our study, with 59% saying that spatial video and 50% saying digital temperature will be used to more immersively engage customers by 2030. But of course, you can use this technology inside the company as well. As an interesting example, 33% of senior managers believe that food in the company canteen can be digitally enhanced to taste like anything by 2030. That could improve perceived quality, but also, of course, cost, and have a positive environmental effect if we move into less meat-based or organic products in that sense. Privacy, however, is going to be a key concern. While 66% think that by 2030, technology will enable them to sense when a colleague is upset, that of course also means that their employer will know when they themselves are upset, posing questions about employee integrity. These findings we also, of course, then took into a VR workshop, and let's have a final look at a clip from the results of that.
Okay. So here we are at one of the group sessions where we did a bit of brainstorming around the key findings from this project. So the participants, they got to read through the key findings themselves and have a discussion about what they thought about these key findings. And then they started noting down using both the pen here, writing things like this one here, for example, they were writing these kinds of things, but also using post-it notes like this one here, for example. So here's a post-it note over here, and they discussed the findings. And in other groups they did the same thing, and then we met up, all of us, and we went through the findings from each group, and they could talk about what they had discussed. I think there was limited time for this workshop, so some of the ideas were more related to then, of course, is this key finding relevant or not? And I think the conclusion among most of the participants was that these key findings were actually quite relevant. But there were also some interesting insights that came out also for me. For example, discussions about how these devices need to really have the ability to incorporate glasses and small things like that in order for this to actually become a reality. There were also two key takeaways, I think, that I hadn't thought so much. Well, one I had thought so much about, which was the discussion around privacy. A lot of the participants did indeed think that privacy was important to discuss also in a enterprise user kind of setting. But the other one was a bit more surprising, and that was about the idea of digital taste. Everyone thought that sounded very strange. Even though actually you can replicate taste, any kind of taste, digitally already today. It's not a product on the market, but it's technically doable, and there are research prototypes where you can do that. But people thought that taste was probably not going to be the key thing for enterprise use of the Internet of Senses. There you go.
Thank you so much for listening. You can download the Dematerialized Office report at ericsson.com/industrylab. And you can also download the original 10 Consumer Trends report about the Internet of Senses at ericsson.com/consumerlab. Have a good day, and most of all, stay safe.